traffic cop vanished in 1979. 15 years later, her patrol car found under the riverbed. The murky waters of the Clearwater River had been exceptionally low that autumn of 1994, revealing secrets that had been buried beneath its depths for over a decade. Jake Morrison, a local fisherman who had been casting his line into these waters for 30 years, noticed something unusual glinting beneath the surface near the old steel bridge that connected the twin towns of Millbrook and Riverside. At first, he thought it might be debris from the recent construction upstream, but as he waded closer, his heart began to race. The distinctive black and white pattern, though faded and covered in algae, was unmistakable. It was a police cruiser, and not just any police cruiser, but one from the late 70s, based on its distinctive design. Michael Patterson was in his office at Patterson & Associates law firm when the call came. Detective Linda Torres from the Millbrook Police Department spoke in measured tones, but Michael could hear the underlying tension in her voice. "Michael, I need you to sit down for this. We found something in the Clearwater River that might be connected to Sarah's case." The mention of his sister's name after 15 years of silence hit Michael like a physical blow. Officer Sarah Patterson had vanished on October 15, 1979, during what should have been a routine traffic patrol shift. She had been 26 years old, dedicated to her job, and planning to get married to her longtime boyfriend David Chun the following spring. The investigation had gone cold within months, leaving their family with nothing but questions and a void that never healed. "What did you find?" Michael managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "A patrol car, submerged under the riverbed. The vehicle identification number matches the unit Sarah was driving the night she disappeared." Michael closed his eyes, feeling the familiar mixture of hope and dread that had defined the past 15 years of his life. After Sarah's disappearance, he had left his job as a prosecutor and opened his own practice, specializing in missing persons cases. Every case he took was, in some way, an attempt to solve the mystery of what happened to his sister. The discovery site was already cordoned off when Michael arrived. The autumn afternoon sun cast long shadows across the riverbank as a specialized recovery team worked to extract the submerged vehicle. Detective Torres, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and graying hair, approached him as he stood at the perimeter. "The preliminary examination shows the car has been down there for a very long time," she explained. "The damage is consistent with prolonged submersion, but we can already see some things that don't add up with the original theory." "What original theory?" Michael asked, though he knew the answer would resurrect painful memories. The official conclusion was that Sarah had likely suffered some kind of breakdown or personal crisis and voluntarily disappeared. Captain Hayes always maintained that there was no evidence of foul play. Captain Robert Hayes. Even hearing the name after all these years made Michael's jaw tighten. Hayes had been the one in charge of Sarah's case, and from the beginning, he had seemed more interested in closing it than solving it. Hayes had retired 5 years ago with full honors, but his handling of Sarah's disappearance had always left Michael with questions. "Detective Torres," Michael said carefully, "I need to know everything you find." Sarah was the most dedicated officer in that department. She would never have just walked away from her life, her job, or her fiancé. As the recovery team finally managed to winch the patrol car onto a flatbed truck, Michael got his first clear look at the vehicle that had been his sister's second home. The 1978 Plymouth Fury still bore the Millbrook Police Department insignia, though it was barely visible under years of river sediment and corrosion. What struck him immediately was the condition of the driver's side door. Even through the damage, he could see that it had been severely dented inward, as if something had struck it with tremendous force. This was definitely not consistent with the car simply driving into the river. Detective Torres noticed his observation. "We're going to have the entire vehicle thoroughly examined by forensics. If there's any evidence left after 15 years underwater, we'll find it." That evening, Michael sat in his study surrounded by the files he had maintained on Sarah's case. Every newspaper clipping, every police report he had been able to obtain, every interview he had conducted with Sarah's friends and colleagues over the years. He had never given up hope that someday he would find answers. Sarah had been working the evening shift on October 15th, 1979, covering traffic patrol along Highway 9, which ran parallel to the Clearwater River. Her last radio check-in had been at 9:47 p.m., reporting a routine traffic stop near mile marker 23. After that, silence. When she failed to report in for her scheduled check at 10:30 p.m., dispatch had tried repeatedly to raise her on the radio. By midnight, search teams were combing the highway. The official investigation had found her patrol car missing and no trace of Sarah herself. Captain Hayes had theorized that she had been under stress, though Michael knew this was completely contrary to Sarah's character and had chosen to disappear voluntarily. The case had been kept open officially, but no real resources had been devoted to it after the first few months. Now, 15 years later, the discovery of her patrol car raised more questions than it answered. If the car had been in the river all this time, where was Sarah? And more importantly, how had the car ended up there? The discovery site was nearly 2 miles from where she had made her last radio call. Michael picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. David Chun, Sarah's former fiancé, now lived in California and worked as an engineer. When David answered, Michael could hear the shock in his voice. "Michael, is everything okay? You have him called in." They found Sarah's patrol car, David, in the Clearwater River. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute before David spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "After all these years, do you think ... Is there any chance she might still be ... double quotes? I don't know," Michael admitted. But I'm going to find out what really happened to her. I promise you that." As Michael hung up the phone, he made a decision that would change everything. He was going to conduct his own investigation, parallel to the official one. He had 15 years of legal experience, connections throughout the law enforcement community, and most importantly, he had something the original investigation had lacked. Someone who refused to accept easy answers about Sarah Patterson's disappearance. The discovery of the patrol car was just the beginning. Michael was certain that someone in Millbrook knew what had really happened to his sister that night in 1979, and he was going to find out who. Detective Linda Torres had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 12 years, but she had never seen a case file quite like the one sitting on her desk. The Sarah Patterson disappearance had been officially classified as a missing person case, but reading through the original investigation reports, she could see glaring omissions and inconsistencies that troubled her professional instincts. The forensic examination of the patrol car had yielded some disturbing preliminary findings. The vehicle showed clear signs of impact damage that was inconsistent with simply driving into the river. More significantly, traces of what appeared to be blood had been found on the interior, though after 15 years of submersion, DNA analysis would be challenging. Michael Patterson sat across from Torres in the conference room at the police station, the same room where he had pleaded with Captain Hayes 15 years earlier to take his sister's disappearance seriously. The irony wasn't lost on him. "The original investigation was woefully inadequate," Torres said, her tone professional but clearly critical. "There are basic procedures that weren't followed, witnesses who were never interviewed, and physical evidence that was either ignored or mishandled. Can you be more specific?" Michael asked, though he suspected he knew what she was going to say. Torres opened a thick file folder. "Your sister's last radio check-in was at 9:47 p.m. from mile marker 23 on Highway 9. She reported conducting a routine traffic stop, but there's no record of any citation being issued that night. No description of the vehicle she stopped, and no follow-up investigation to identify who she might have been interacting with." Michael felt a familiar surge of anger. Hayes always said there was no evidence of foul play, but it sounds like they never looked for any evidence in the first place. That's not all, Torres continued. I've been going through the duty rosters from that period. Sarah was originally scheduled to work the day shift on October 15th, but the assignment was changed at the last minute. She was switched to evening patrol, specifically assigned to Highway 9, just 2 hours before her shift began. This was new information, and it immediately raised red flags for Michael, who authorized the schedule change. Captain Robert Hayes. The name hung in the air between them like an accusation. Michael had always suspected that Hayes was hiding something about Sarah's disappearance, but he had never been able to prove it. Hayes had been a 20-year veteran of the force in 1979, well respected in the community and seemingly above suspicion. I need to interview Hayes, Torres said. He's retired, but he still lives in town. However, I want to gather more information first. Michael leaned forward. Detective, I've spent 15 years thinking about this case. I have files, contacts, and information that might help. I'd like to work with you on this. Torres considered this carefully. You're not law enforcement anymore, Michael, and you're personally involved. That could complicate things. It could also help solve them. I know this case better than anyone, and I have resources that might be useful. After a moment, Torres nodded. Unofficially, I'm open to sharing information, but this has to be done by the book. If we're going to expose what really happened to Sarah, the case has to be bulletproof. Their first joint investigation led them to the Millbrook Police Department's evidence storage facility. Sarah's personal effects from her patrol duties had been stored there since 1979, largely untouched since the original investigation was suspended. Among the items were Sarah's personal logbook, her citation book, and her duty belt, all things that would normally have been in the patrol car with her. The fact that these items had been found in her locker suggested that she had returned to the station at some point during her shift, something that had never been mentioned in the original reports. This changes the timeline significantly, Torres observed. If she came back to the station, when did that happen? And why? Michael examined Sarah's logbook, reading her neat handwriting for the first time in 15 years. The entries were routine until the final day, October 15th, 79. Evening patrol assignment changed. HC requesting meeting after shift. Something doesn't feel right. HE, Michael said, his pulse quickening. Hayes' initials are RH, not HC. Torres looked at the entry more carefully. Harold Crawford. He was a sergeant in 1979, worked closely with Hayes. He died in a car accident about 5 years after Sarah disappeared. The implications were troubling. If Sarah had been concerned enough to write that something didn't feel right, and if she had been scheduled to meet with Crawford after her shift, it suggested that she had been aware of some kind of problem or danger. Their investigation led them next to Sarah's former colleagues, who were still alive and willing to talk. Officer Patricia Murphy, now retired, had been Sarah's closest friend on the force. Sarah was worrying about something in the weeks before she disappeared. Murphy told them over coffee at her kitchen table. She never said exactly what, but she mentioned that she had seen something she shouldn't have seen. What kind of something? Torres asked. She thought there might be corruption in the department. Officers taking money, looking the other way on certain activities. Sarah was very by the book, and it troubled her. Michael felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to form. Did she mention any names? Anyone specific she was concerned about? Murphy hesitated. She was careful not to make accusations without proof. But she did say that some of the senior officers seemed to be living beyond their means. Nice cars, expensive watches, things that didn't match a police salary. Was Captain Hayes one of those officers? Torres asked directly. I can't say for certain, but Hayes always seemed to have money. And he was very protective of certain cases, very controlling about who could investigate what. As they left Murphy's house, Michael and Torres both realized they were dealing with something much larger than a simple missing person case. If Sarah had discovered corruption within the police department and had been planning to expose it, That would provide a powerful motive for someone to want her silenced. We need to be very careful about who we trust within the department, Torres warned. If there was corruption in 1979, some of those people might still be around. That evening, Michael received an unexpected phone call. The voice was elderly, male, and cautious. "Mr. Patterson? This is Frank Novak. I heard they found your sister's car. I think we need to talk." Novak had been a mechanic at the police department's motor pool in 1979. He was one of the last people to see Sarah alive. She came by the garage around 8:30 that night, Novak explained when they met at a diner outside of town. Said she needed to check something on her car, but she seemed nervous, kept looking over her shoulder. "Did she say what she was checking?" "She asked me about the radio system. Wanted to know if conversations could be monitored or recorded. I told her that officially no, but that there were ways to listen in if someone really wanted to." This revelation cast Sarah's final radio transmission in a new light. If she had suspected her communications were being monitored, her careful wording during that last call made more sense. "Mr. Novak," Torres said carefully, "why didn't you report this information during the original investigation?" Novak looked uncomfortable. "Nobody asked me. And honestly, after what happened to Sarah, I was scared. There were rumors that asking too many questions about certain things could be dangerous for your health." As they drove back toward town, Michael felt a mixture of vindication and dread. After 15 years, he was finally getting the answers he had been seeking. But those answers suggested that Sarah's disappearance had been the result of a deliberate conspiracy involving people in positions of trust and authority. "Tomorrow we interview Hayes," Torres said grimly. "It's time to start asking the hard questions." The house on Maple Street where retired Captain Robert Hayes lived was modest but well-maintained, with a newer model Cadillac in the driveway that seemed expensive for a retired police officer's pension. Michael Patterson sat in Detective Torres's unmarked car, studying the man who had controlled his sister's investigation 15 years ago. Hayes answered the door with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, though age had softened his imposing frame. At 68, he still carried himself like a cop, and his eyes were sharp as they took in his unexpected visitors. "Detective Torres, isn't it? And Michael Patterson. I heard they found Sarah's car. Terrible thing, just terrible." The practiced sympathy in Hayes' voice immediately put Michael on edge, but he remained silent as Torres took the lead. "Captain Hayes, we're reopening the investigation into Officer Patterson's disappearance. We'd like to ask you some questions about the original case." Hayes invited them in, but his hospitality felt forced. The living room was comfortable, decorated with police commendations and photographs spanning Hayes' 30-year career. Michael noticed several pictures from department social events in the late 70s. "I always regretted that we couldn't bring closure to the Patterson family," Hayes began. "Sarah was a fine officer, dedicated to the job. Her disappearance was one of the most puzzling cases I ever handled." Torres consulted her notes. "According to the records, you personally changed Sarah's work assignment on October 15th, switching her from day shift to evening patrol on Highway 9. Can you explain the reason for that change?" A flicker of something annoyance, concern, crossed Hayes' face. "Staffing issues. We were short-handed on the evening shift, and Sarah was reliable. It was a routine administrative decision." "But the change was made only 2 hours before her shift," Michael interjected, unable to remain silent. "That seems unusual." Hayes fixed him with a steady stare. "Mr. Patterson, I understand your need for answers. The police work sometimes requires last-minute adjustments. There was nothing unusual about reassigning officers based on operational needs." Torres pressed further. "We've discovered that Sarah returned to the station at some point during her shift on October 15th. Her personal effects were found in her locker, not in the patrol car. Do you have any recollection of seeing her at the station that evening?" "No, I don't recall seeing her after the shift briefing." Michael watched Hayes carefully as he answered. The man was composed, but there were subtle tells of slight tension around his eyes. the way his hands clasped a bit too tightly in his lap. "Captain, we've also learned that Sarah had expressed concerns about possible corruption within the department in the weeks before her disappearance. Were you aware of any such concerns?" This time, Hayes' reaction was more pronounced. He sat back in his chair, and his expression hardened. "That's a very serious accusation, Detective. I ran a clean department. If Sarah had specific concerns about misconduct, she should have brought them to me through proper channels." "Maybe she tried to," Michael said quietly. Hayes turned to face him directly. "What exactly are you implying, Mr. Patterson?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating that my sister discovered something that got her killed, and I think you know what that was." The room fell silent for a long moment. Hayes' facade of helpful cooperation began to crack. "I think this interview is over. If you have specific allegations to make, you can discuss them with my attorney." As they left Hayes' house, Torres was quiet until they reached the car. "He's hiding something," she said finally. "The question is whether it's directly related to Sarah's murder or if it's something else he's trying to protect. What's our next move?" "We need to dig deeper into the department's activities in 1979. If there was corruption, there might be records, witnesses, or other evidence that Hayes couldn't control." Their investigation led them to the courthouse, where Michael used his legal connections to access financial records and court documents from the late 70s. What they found was disturbing: a pattern of cases that had been dismissed or plea bargained down despite strong evidence, particularly involving drug trafficking and organized crime. Even more troubling was the discovery that several of these cases had been investigated by officers who had subsequently left the force or died under questionable circumstances. Harold Crawford, the sergeant Sarah was supposed to meet, had died in what was ruled a single-car accident on a clear night on a straight road. "This is starting to look like a conspiracy," Torres observed as they reviewed the documents. "If Sarah stumbled onto evidence of police corruption involving drug money, that would explain a lot." Michael had been thinking the same thing. The timing fits. 1979 was when cocaine trafficking really started to explode in this region. The money involved would have been enormous. Their research was interrupted by a phone call to Torres from the forensics lab. The news was both encouraging and disturbing. "They've confirmed that the blood in Sarah's patrol car is human, and preliminary analysis suggests it's consistent with her blood type. More significantly, they found evidence of gunshot residue in the vehicle." Michael felt his world shift. After 15 years of hoping his sister might somehow still be alive, the evidence was painting a clear picture of murder. "There's more," Torres continued after hanging up. "The damage to the patrol car shows that it was deliberately pushed or driven into the river. This wasn't an accident." That evening, Michael was working late in his office when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside. The building should have been empty, and the security guard wasn't scheduled to make rounds for another hour. The footsteps stopped outside his door. Michael quietly moved to his desk drawer, where he kept a .38 revolver he had started carrying after receiving some threats from opposing parties in past cases. A soft knock came at the door, followed by a voice he didn't recognize. "Mr. Patterson? I have information about your sister." Michael approached the door cautiously. "Who are you?" "Someone who was there that night. Someone who's been carrying this secret for 15 years. Against his better judgment, Michael opened the door. Standing in the hallway was a man in his 60s, thin and nervous, with the weathered look of someone who had lived a hard life. "My name is Eddie Kowalski. I used to work dispatch for the police department. I was on duty the night Sarah disappeared." Michael gestured for him to come in, but kept his hand near his weapon. "Why are you coming forward now?" Kowalski sat down heavily in the chair across from Michael's desk. "Because I'm dying. Cancer. And I can't take this to my grave." "What do you know about Sarah's disappearance?" "I know she came back to the station that night around 9:15. She was upset, scared about something. She asked to use a secure phone line, said she needed to call someone outside the department. This was consistent with what they had learned about Sarah's personal effects being in her locker. Did you hear the conversation? Part of it. She was talking to someone about evidence, said she had proof of something, but needed help figuring out what to do with it. She mentioned names, Hayes, Crawford, and someone else I couldn't make out. Michael leaned forward. What happened next? Hayes showed up at the station. He seemed surprised to see her there. They talked privately in his office for about 10 minutes. Then she left to go back on patrol. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Why didn't you report this during the original investigation? Kowalski's hands shook slightly as he answered. Because Hayes was running the investigation, and because Crawford made it clear to me that forgetting what I had seen that night would be the healthy thing to do. After Kowalski left, Michael called Torres immediately. They were getting close to the truth, but they were also entering dangerous territory. If Hayes and others had killed once to protect their secrets, they might be willing to kill again. We need to be very careful from here on out, Torres warned. If our investigation threatens the wrong people, we could be putting ourselves at risk. Michael understood the danger, but after 15 years of questions, he was finally getting answers about Sarah's fate. There was no turning back now. Detective Torres arrived at the Millbrook Police Department early the next morning to find Chief Patricia Wells waiting in her office. Wells had been with the department for only 3 years, having been brought in from outside to modernize operations and improve community relations. Her expression was grave. Linda, I've been getting calls. Some very uncomfortable calls about your investigation into the Patterson case. What kind of calls, Chief? The kind that suggests certain people are nervous about what you might find. I need to know exactly what you're dealing with here. Torres spent the next hour briefing Wells on their discoveries. The evidence of murder, the corruption allegations, and the connections to former department personnel. Wells listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled. This is potentially explosive, Wells said finally. If there was systematic corruption in the 70s and 80s, it could implicate people who are still in positions of power, not just in law enforcement, but in the courts, city government, maybe even state level. Chief, are you telling me to back off? Wells considered this carefully. I'm telling you to be thorough, be careful, and document everything. If we're going to expose corruption that deep, we need to make sure our case is bulletproof. Meanwhile, Michael Patterson was conducting his own research into the financial records of former police officers from the 1979 timeframe. What he discovered painted a disturbing picture of sudden wealth that couldn't be explained by police salaries. Robert Hayes had purchased his house on Maple Street in 1980, paying cash for a property worth 3 times his annual salary. Harold Crawford had owned expensive cars and had taken several overseas vacations in the months before his death. Even more suspicious, several other officers from that period had left the force abruptly, some relocating to other states. Michael's investigation led him to contact retired FBI agent Catherine Morrison, who had worked organized crime cases in the region during the late 70s and early 80s. The drug trafficking through this area was sophisticated, Morrison explained during their meeting at her home. We suspected that local law enforcement was compromised, but we could never develop sufficient evidence to pursue federal charges. What kind of trafficking are we talking about? Cocaine, primarily. There was a major pipeline running from Miami through various interstate highways, including Highway 9 where your sister was patrolling. The money involved was staggering millions of dollars changing hands. Morrison pulled out a thick file folder. I kept copies of our intelligence reports from that period. There were several incidents where drug shipments seemed to have advance warning of law enforcement activity. Michael studied the documents, his anger growing as he read reports of failed operations and missed opportunities. Agent Morrison, do you think my sister might have stumbled onto evidence of this corruption? It's very possible. A conscientious traffic officer working Highway 9 would have been in a perfect position to notice unusual patterns. The same vehicles passing through at regular intervals, cars that didn't match their drivers, traffic stops that were mysteriously aborted. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a complete picture. Sarah Patterson had discovered evidence of police corruption involving drug trafficking. and she had been murdered to prevent her from exposing the conspiracy. Torres and Michael met that afternoon to compare their findings. The evidence was compelling, but still largely circumstantial. They needed something more concrete to build a prosecutable case. "We need to find where Sarah discovered the evidence," Torres said. "There has to be something specific that triggered her investigation." Their break came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, who had worked as a civilian clerk in the police department in 1979, contacted Torres after hearing about the reopened investigation. "I found something when I was cleaning out old files before I retired last year," Santos explained. "I kept it because it seemed important, but I didn't know what to do with it." What Santos had found was a manila envelope hidden behind a filing cabinet in the records room. Inside was a collection of documents in Sarah Patterson's handwriting: license plate numbers, dates and times, notes about suspicious vehicle stops, and most damning of all, copies of incident reports that had never been filed. Sarah was building a case, Torres realized as they reviewed the documents. She was systematically documenting evidence of corruption. The license plate numbers corresponded to vehicles that had been stopped multiple times but never cited. The incident reports described traffic stops where large amounts of cash and suspicious cargo had been observed but not investigated further. Most significantly, several of the reports mentioned specific officers who had intervened to prevent searches or arrests. Robert Hayes, Harold Crawford, and 3 other officers who had all left the force by 1985. "This is it," Michael said, his voice tight with emotion. "This is what got Sarah killed." Among the documents was a letter Sarah had begun writing but never finished. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to report serious misconduct within the Millbrook Police Department. Over the past several months, I have observed and documented evidence of officers accepting bribes to allow drug trafficking along Highway 9. The corruption appears to involve senior personnel, including my immediate supervisor." The letter ended mid-sentence, suggesting that Sarah had been interrupted while writing it. Torres immediately contacted the district attorney's office to discuss the evidence they had gathered. District Attorney James Fletcher was a career prosecutor who had built his reputation on fighting corruption. "This is potentially the biggest corruption case this county has ever seen," Fletcher told them after reviewing the evidence. "But we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. If word gets out prematurely, evidence could disappear and witnesses could be intimidated or worse." Fletcher assigned a special prosecutor to work with Torres, and they began building arrest warrants for the surviving conspirators. Hayes was the obvious primary target, but they also identified 2 other former officers who were still alive: Detective Raymond Polk, now living in Florida, and Sergeant Marcus Wright, who had become a private security consultant. "The challenge," Fletcher explained, "is that most of this corruption occurred 15 years ago. Statute of limitations issues will complicate prosecution unless we can prove the murder conspiracy." As news of the investigation began to spread through law enforcement circles, Torres started receiving warnings from colleagues. Several veteran officers suggested that she was opening old wounds that were better left alone. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. Michael, meanwhile, was experiencing more direct intimidation. His law office received anonymous phone calls warning him to let sleeping dogs lie. His car tires were slashed twice in 1 week, and he noticed the same dark sedan following him on several occasions. "They're getting desperate," Torres observed, "which means we're getting close to something they really don't want exposed." The breakthrough came when they located Frank Martinez, a former drug dealer who had been arrested by Sarah Patterson just 2 weeks before her disappearance. Martinez was now living in witness protection after cooperating with federal authorities in a major trafficking case. Officer Patterson was different from the others. Martinez told them during a carefully arranged interview. "She couldn't be bought. When she stopped you, she did her job regardless of who you knew or how much money you offered." Martinez provided the crucial detail they needed. He had witnessed Sarah Patterson conducting surveillance of a drug transfer on Highway 9 on October 10, 1979. just 5 days before her disappearance. She was taking pictures, Martinez recalled. She saw the money changing hands, saw which cops were getting paid. She had evidence that could have brought down the whole operation. The net was closing around Robert Hayes and his co-conspirators. But as Torres and Michael prepared for the arrests, they were unaware that Hayes had learned about their investigation and was preparing his own desperate response. The phone call came at 3:17 a.m., jarring Michael Patterson from a restless sleep. Detective Torres's voice was tight with urgency. "Michael, get dressed and meet me at the station immediately. We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Someone broke into the evidence storage facility tonight. Sarah's documents are missing." Michael felt his stomach drop. After 15 years of searching for answers, they had finally assembled the pieces of the puzzle, only to have the crucial evidence stolen. How did they get past security? That's what we're trying to figure out. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. This was an inside job. At the police station, Michael found Torres working with the department's internal affairs investigators to review security footage and interview personnel. The break-in had been professionally executed, no alarms triggered, no obvious signs of forced entry, and only Sarah's evidence files had been taken. Chief Wells was furious. "This investigation has been compromised from the inside. Someone with access to our facilities and knowledge of the case has been feeding information to the suspects." Torres had reached the same conclusion. "We've been careful about who we've shared information with, but obviously not careful enough." The theft of the evidence was a devastating setback, but it also confirmed that they were on the right track. Hayes and his associates were desperate enough to risk a burglary to protect their secrets. "Do we have copies of any of the documents?" Michael asked. "Some of them. I photographed the most important pieces before storing them. But the originals are gone, and without proper chain of custody, the photographs might not be admissible in court." Despite the setback, Torres and Michael decided to proceed with confronting Hayes directly. They had enough evidence to at least pressure him into making mistakes, and his desperation might lead him to reveal more than he intended. They found Hayes at his favorite restaurant, where he was having lunch with 2 other men Michael didn't recognize. One was tall and thin with the bearing of a former military man, while the other was short and stocky with expensive clothes and multiple gold rings. Hayes saw them approaching, and his expression darkened. He said something to his companions, who immediately stood and left the restaurant. "Captain Hayes," Torres said as she and Michael approached his table, "we need to talk. I have nothing to say to you without my lawyer present." "That's your right," Michael said, taking the seat across from him. "But we thought you might want to know that we've recovered the evidence Sarah compiled before her murder." It was a bluff, but Hayes' reaction confirmed its effectiveness. His face went pale, and his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "I don't know what you're talking about," Hayes said, but his voice lacked conviction. Torres leaned forward. "We know about the drug money, Robert. We know about the protection payments, the staged traffic stops, the whole operation. We have witnesses, financial records, and Sarah's documentation of your activities." Hayes stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. Several other diners turned to look at the commotion. "You have nothing," he said, his voice rising. Sarah Patterson was an unstable officer who couldn't handle the pressures of police work. She killed herself, and you're trying to create some elaborate conspiracy theory to avoid accepting the truth. Then explain how her patrol car ended up in the river with bullet holes and blood evidence, Michael challenged. For a moment, Hayes looked like he might say something, but then he caught himself. He threw money on the table and headed for the exit. "This conversation is over. Any further harassment will be reported to my attorney and the state police." As Hayes left the restaurant, Torres and Michael noticed that he was immediately joined by the 2 men who had been sitting with him. The group had a brief, animated conversation in the parking lot before driving away in separate vehicles. "Those weren't social acquaintances," Torres observed. "Hayes is definitely not in this alone." Their confrontation with Hayes had an immediate effect. Within hours, Michael received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice was electronically distorted, but the message was clear. Stop digging into things that don't concern you, or you'll end up like your sister. Torres received a similar warning through an anonymous letter left on her car windshield. Some secrets are worth killing for. Drop the investigation or face the consequences. Rather than intimidating them, the threats confirmed that they were close to exposing the truth. But they also represented a serious escalation in the danger they faced. Chief Wells assigned additional security for Torres and suggested that Michael consider protective measures as well. If these people killed once to protect their secrets, they won't hesitate to kill again. That evening, Michael was working late in his office when he heard the sound of breaking glass from the front of the building. He immediately called 911 and drew his pistol, moving carefully toward the sound. The front window of his law office had been shattered by a brick wrapped in paper. Written on the paper in block letters was a simple message: final warning. By the time police arrived, Michael had decided that passive investigation was no longer sufficient. If Hayes and his associates wanted to play hardball, he was prepared to respond in kind. "We need to force their hand," he told Torres the next morning. "They're obviously getting information about our investigation from someone inside the department. We need to control the flow of information and see who reacts." Torres was hesitant. "That's dangerous, Michael. If we start feeding false information, we could compromise our legitimate investigation." "We don't have a legitimate investigation anymore. They've stolen our evidence and they know our every move. We need to change tactics." They developed a plan to spread different pieces of false information to different people within the police department. Then, monitor which false information made its way back to Hayes. It was a dangerous game, but it might help them identify their leak. Torres told Sergeant Williams that they had recovered additional documents from a safety deposit box Sarah had rented. She informed Detective Parker that they had identified a witness who could place Hayes at the scene of Sarah's murder. And she told records clerk Janet Morrison that they had traced Hayes's financial records and found evidence of large cash deposits. Within 24 hours, they had their answer. Hayes contacted his attorney specifically asking about the admissibility of evidence found in safety deposit boxes, information that had only been shared with Sergeant Williams. Williams has been feeding Hayes information, Torres realized. That explains how they knew exactly what evidence to steal and when we were getting close. Sergeant Williams had been with the department for over 20 years and was considered above suspicion. His betrayal explained how Hayes had stayed one step ahead of their investigation. Confronting Williams required careful planning. They needed to catch him in the act of sharing information with Hayes, or at least force him to admit his role in the conspiracy. Torres arranged to have Williams followed, and they soon discovered that he was meeting regularly with Robert Hayes at a small bar outside of town. The meetings appeared to be prearranged and secretive, with both men taking precautions to avoid being seen together. "We've got him," Torres said, as they reviewed surveillance photos of Williams and Hayes meeting. "But now we need to decide how to use this information." Their decision was made for them when Williams made a fatal mistake. During their next fabricated briefing, Torres told him that they had scheduled a raid on Hayes' house for the following morning, providing specific details about timing and personnel. That evening, Michael was driving home when he noticed a dark sedan following him, the same sedan he had seen several times before. Instead of leading them to his house, he drove to a busy shopping center and called Torres. "They're watching me. The leak from Williams has put us in immediate danger. Meet me at the safe house we discussed. It's time to take these people down." As Michael drove through the darkened streets toward the rendezvous point, he realized that 15 years after Sarah's murder, the case was finally reaching its climax. But the confrontation that awaited them would determine whether justice would finally be served or whether Sarah's killers would claim more victims. The safe house was a nondescript apartment building on the outskirts of town, maintained by the district attorney's office for witness protection and sensitive operations. Detective Torres had arranged to meet Michael there along with Special Prosecutor Ellen Rodriguez and FBI Agent Morrison, who had joined the investigation due to its federal implications. The situation has escalated beyond a simple murder investigation, Rodriguez explained as they gathered around a table covered with documents and photographs. We're dealing with a criminal conspiracy that likely extends beyond Hayes and his immediate associates. Agent Morrison spread out surveillance photos showing Hayes meeting with various individuals over the past week. We've identified at least 6 people who are connected to the original drug trafficking operation. Some are former police officers, others are civilians who were part of the distribution network. Michael studied the photographs, recognizing some faces from his sister's documented investigations. These are the people Sarah was building a case against. And they're the people who have the most to lose if this conspiracy is exposed, Torres added, which makes them extremely dangerous. Rodriguez outlined their strategy. We're going to use the information leak from Sergeant Williams to our advantage. We'll feed him false information about our next moves, then monitor how Hayes and his associates respond. The plan was risky but elegant. They would tell Williams that they had located a crucial witness who could testify about Sarah's murder, someone who had allegedly seen her alive after her supposed final radio transmission. They would arrange a fake meeting with this fictional witness, then observe who showed up to prevent the testimony. The key is making them believe they have an opportunity to eliminate the last threat to their security, Morrison explained. If they take the bait, we'll have them on conspiracy charges at minimum. Michael was assigned a crucial role in the operation. He would pose as the fictional witness, using his knowledge of the case to provide convincing details about what Sarah had allegedly told him before her death. This puts you in significant danger, Torres warned. If they believe you're a legitimate threat, they might try to kill you. They've already threatened to kill me. At least this way, we have some control over the situation. The operation was scheduled for the following evening at a warehouse district on the edge of town. Michael would meet with Torres in a prearranged location, supposedly to provide his witness testimony. Hayes and his associates would presumably learn of the meeting through Williams and attempt to interfere. As they prepared for the operation, Torres received disturbing intelligence from her contacts in other law enforcement agencies. Hayes has been making phone calls to people in other states. We think he's trying to organize some kind of coordinated response to our investigation. This development added urgency to their plans. If Hayes was mobilizing additional resources, they needed to act quickly before the conspiracy could regroup and eliminate evidence or witnesses. The next morning brought unexpected developments. Sergeant Williams approached Torres with what appeared to be legitimate information about the case. Detective, I've been thinking about the Patterson investigation, and I remembered something that might be important. Torres maintained her professional demeanor while recording the conversation. What did you remember, Sergeant? I was on duty the night Sarah disappeared. I remember Captain Hayes leaving the station around 10:30 p.m., which was unusual because he normally worked day shifts. He seemed agitated about something. This was potentially valuable information, but it could also be Williams attempting to provide misleading evidence to throw off their investigation. Torres decided to test his loyalties. That's very helpful, Sergeant. We're planning to interview a witness tomorrow night who might be able to corroborate that timeline. The meeting is scheduled for 8 p.m. at the Morrison Warehouse on Industrial Boulevard. Williams nodded and made notes, exactly as Torres had expected. Do you need additional security for the interview? No, we want to keep it low-key. Just Detective Parker and myself. Within hours of this conversation, Torres observed Williams making a phone call from his car in the parking lot. Their trap was working. As evening approached, Michael felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and fear that had defined his 15-year quest for answers about Sarah's fate. Tonight, one way or another, he would finally confront the people responsible for his sister's murder. The Morrison Warehouse was a large, abandoned building that had once been used for manufacturing. It provided multiple entry and exit points, good visibility for surveillance, and enough space for the law enforcement teams to position themselves safely. Torres and the FBI team arrived 2 hours before the scheduled meeting to set up surveillance equipment and position backup personnel. Michael would arrive precisely at 8 p.m., giving Hayes and his associates time to set up their own response. Remember, Agent Morrison briefed Michael over the radio. Your job is to get them talking. We need them to admit their involvement in the conspiracy, preferably on record. Michael was wearing a wire and carrying a backup recording device. If they could get Hayes to confess to Sarah's murder, they would have the evidence needed for prosecution. At 7:45 p.m., surveillance teams reported the arrival of several vehicles in the warehouse district. Hayes was there, along with at least 4 other individuals. 2 of the men were carrying what appeared to be weapons. This is more serious than we anticipated, Morrison reported. They're treating this as a military operation. Michael approached the warehouse exactly on schedule, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. After 15 years of wondering what had happened to Sarah, he was finally going to get answers directly from the people responsible. As he entered the building, he could see figures moving in the shadows. Hayes stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, flanked by 2 men Michael didn't recognize. "Mr. Patterson," Hayes said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "I understand you have something to tell us about your sister." "That's right," Michael replied, his hand hovering near the panic button that would signal the backup teams. "I know what really happened to Sarah, and I know who was responsible." Hayes moved closer, and Michael could see the desperation in his eyes. "Then perhaps it's time we had an honest conversation about the past." The confrontation that Michael had been preparing for since 1979 was finally beginning, but the next few minutes would determine whether justice would be served, or whether he would become the next victim of the conspiracy that had claimed his sister's life. The abandoned Morrison warehouse felt like a cathedral of shadows as Michael Patterson faced the man who had controlled his sister's murder investigation 15 years earlier. Robert Hayes stood 20 feet away, flanked by 2 armed men, whose faces Michael couldn't quite make out in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. "You've been very persistent, Mr. Patterson," Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority he had wielded as a police captain, though now it was edged with desperation. Some would say foolishly persistent. Michael's hand remained near the panic button that would summon the FBI backup teams, but he needed Hayes to keep talking. The wire recording their conversation would be crucial evidence if they survived the next few minutes. "I've been persistent because my sister deserves justice," Michael replied, "and because people like you think you can get away with murder if you hide behind a badge long enough." Hayes laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Justice? Your sister was going to destroy good men over her naive idealism. She couldn't understand that sometimes you have to bend the rules to keep order." "Bend the rules? You were taking money from drug dealers while wearing a police uniform. We were keeping the worst elements contained," Hayes snapped. "The drug trade was going to exist whether we participated or not. At least our involvement kept it from spiraling completely out of control." Michael felt a surge of anger at Hayes' rationalization. "And when Sarah threatened to expose your corruption, you murdered her." "Sarah forced our hand," Hayes admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She wouldn't listen to reason. She had evidence that could have destroyed dozens of careers, broken up families, sent good men to prison." Through his earpiece, Michael could hear Agent Morrison's voice. "Keep him talking. We need details about the murder. How did you do it?" Michael asked, "How did you kill a fellow police officer?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment, and Michael wondered if he had pushed too hard. But then the former captain began to speak, and the words poured out like a confession that had been building pressure for 15 years. "We didn't plan to kill her, not at first. Crawford and I tried to reason with her, tried to make her understand that she was threatening something bigger than herself. But Sarah was always stubborn, always had to do things by the book." "So you murdered her for doing her job?" "We arranged to meet her at mile marker 23 after her shift. Crawford was supposed to convince her to destroy the evidence she had gathered. But she recorded the conversation, Michael. She had a hidden tape recorder running the entire time. Michael felt his breath catch. Sarah had been even more thorough in building her case than they had realized. When Crawford realized she was recording him, he panicked. There was a struggle, and Hayes paused, his voice breaking slightly. The gun went off. It was an accident, but she was dead, and we had a recording of Crawford trying to bribe a police officer. So you covered it up. We had to. Crawford's career, my career, the careers of 8 other officers were on that tape. We staged the scene to look like she had driven into the river, but the current was stronger than we expected. The car got stuck in the mud instead of being carried downstream. Michael pressed for more details. What happened to Sarah's body? Hayes looked uncomfortable. We can leave her in the car. Too much risk of discovery. We buried her in the woods about 10 miles from town. The admission hit Michael like a physical blow. After 15 years of wondering, he finally knew his sister's fate. But the knowledge brought no relief, only a deeper sense of loss. Where exactly? Michael demanded. It doesn't matter now, Hayes said, his demeanor changing as he seemed to remember the danger of his situation. What matters is making sure this conversation never leaves this warehouse. Michael realized that Hayes had revealed too much to let any witnesses survive. The panic button was within reach, but activating it would bring the FBI teams into immediate danger. You can't kill everyone who knows the truth, Michael said, backing slowly toward the exit. Detective Torres knows everything. The FBI knows everything. Killing me won't solve your problems. It will eliminate the most persistent threat, Hayes replied, nodding to his armed companions. Michael activated the panic button and dove behind a concrete pillar as gunfire erupted in the warehouse. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and bullets sparked off concrete and metal surfaces. FBI, drop your weapons. Agent Morrison's voice boomed through a megaphone as tactical teams stormed through multiple entrances. The next few minutes were chaos. Hayes and his men were caught in crossfire from multiple directions as FBI agents surrounded the building. Michael pressed himself against the concrete pillar, listening to shouts and gunfire echoing through the warehouse. When the shooting stopped, Agent Morrison's voice came through Michael's earpiece. Stay down until we give the all clear. It took another 10 minutes for the tactical teams to secure the building. When Michael finally emerged from cover, he found Hayes wounded but alive, sitting against a wall with his hands cuffed behind his back. One of his companions was dead, killed in the exchange of gunfire, while the other was wounded and receiving medical attention. Did you get it all? Michael asked Agent Morrison as paramedics checked him for injuries. Every word, Morrison confirmed. Hayes confessed to conspiracy, murder, and obstruction of justice. We have enough evidence to prosecute not just him, but everyone connected to the original conspiracy. Detective Torres appeared at Michael's side, her expression a mixture of relief and satisfaction. It's over, Michael. After 15 years, we finally have answers. But Michael knew it wasn't quite over yet. Hayes had revealed the location of Sarah's remains, and until they found her body, there would be no complete closure for their family. He told me where they buried Sarah, Michael said quietly. 10 miles from town, in the woods. Torres nodded grimly. We'll find her, Michael, and we'll bring her home. As Hayes was loaded into an ambulance under heavy guard, he looked at Michael one final time. The arrogance and authority were gone, replaced by the hollow expression of a man who had finally been brought to account for his crimes. The conspiracy that had claimed Sarah Patterson's life was finally exposed, but the full scope of the corruption would take months to unravel completely. The interrogation room at the FBI field office in Albany was stark and windowless, designed to focus a suspect's attention entirely on the questions being asked. Robert Hayes sat across from Special Prosecutor Ellen Rodriguez and Agent Morrison, his lawyer present but offering little resistance to the process. Hayes seemed to have reached a decision that confession was his only viable option. Michael Patterson watched through one-way glass as the man who had covered up his sister's murder for 15 years finally told the complete truth. Detective Torres stood beside him, both of them witnessing the end of a deception that had defined their lives for over a decade. "Let's start from the beginning," Rodriguez said, her voice professionally neutral despite the significance of the case. "Tell us about the corruption in the Millbrook Police Department in 1979. Hayes looked older than his 68 years, the weight of his secrets finally visible in his posture and expression. "It started small," he began. "A few $100s to look the other way when certain vehicles passed through town. The drug dealers were going to use Highway 9 whether we cooperated or not. At least this way, we had some control over their activities." "Who initiated the arrangement?" "Harold Crawford. He had gambling debts, needed money fast. He made contact with the trafficking organization and proposed a protection scheme." Agent Morrison leaned forward. "How many officers were involved?" "8 total, including myself and Crawford. Patrol officers, detectives, even a dispatcher. Everyone had their role in making sure certain vehicles weren't stopped or searched too thoroughly." The scope of the corruption was staggering. Nearly a quarter of the Millbrook Police Department had been compromised, creating a criminal conspiracy that had operated for years. "Tell us about Sarah Patterson's investigation," Rodriguez continued. Hayes' expression darkened. "Sarah was always by the book, always asking questions. In early October 1979, she started noticing patterns in traffic stops. Vehicles that were stopped but never cited. Stops that were mysteriously aborted. What did she do with these observations? She began conducting her own surveillance during off-duty hours. She photographed meetings between our officers and the drug dealers, documented license plates and suspicious activities. She was building a comprehensive case against us." Michael felt a surge of pride in his sister's dedication to justice, even as the details of her investigation revealed the danger she had placed herself in. "When did you become aware of her investigation?" Rodriguez asked. "October 12th. Crawford noticed she was asking questions about his activities, requesting files that weren't related to her patrol duties. We realized she was getting close to exposing the entire operation." "What was your initial response?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We decided to transfer her to a different assignment, get her away from Highway 9. But she refused the transfer, said she was in the middle of an important investigation. So you decided to eliminate her?" "Not at first," Hayes insisted. "We tried to reason with her, tried to make her understand the bigger picture. Crawford arranged to meet with her on October 15th after her shift." Rodriguez consulted her notes. "But first, you changed her shift assignment that day, from day patrol to evening Highway 9. We needed her in a specific location at a specific time. The meeting had to look routine, not like a special arrangement." The calculated nature of the setup chilled Michael. These men had spent days planning to confront his sister, setting the stage for what they knew might become her murder. "Tell us about the meeting on October 15th, Rodriguez continued. Hayes took a deep breath before answering. "Crawford and I met Sarah at mile marker 23 around 10:15 p.m. We tried to convince her to abandon her investigation, offered her money, promised her promotions if she would just forget what she had seen." "How did she respond?" "She said she had taken an oath to uphold the law and she wasn't going to be bought off. She told us she had already prepared a complete report of our activities and was planning to present it to the state police the next day." "What happened next?" Hayes paused for a long moment, and Michael could see the weight of the memory in his expression. Crawford panicked. He pulled out his service weapon and pointed it at Sarah, told her she was going to destroy that report or he would make sure she never filed it. But Sarah had been recording the entire conversation with a hidden tape recorder. "She recorded your attempt to bribe her?" "Everything. Crawford's threats, our admissions of taking money from drug dealers, even our discussion of how to cover up the corruption. When Crawford realized he was being recorded, he tried to grab the recorder away from her, Rodriguez leaned back in her chair. And that's when she was shot? They struggled for control of the weapon. Sarah was trying to get back to her patrol car. Crawford was trying to get the tape recorder. The gun went off during the struggle. Was it accidental? Hayes hesitated before answering. The shooting was accidental, but what happened afterward wasn't. Explain what you mean. Sarah was wounded but still alive when the gun went off. She was lying on the ground, bleeding, asking us to call for an ambulance. We had a choice to make. Michael felt his hands clench into fists as he watched Hayes describe his sister's final moments. What choice did you make? Crawford said we couldn't let her live. She had the tape recording, she had evidence of our corruption, and she had just witnessed Crawford threatening her with a weapon. Even if the shooting was accidental, we were looking at multiple felony charges. So you decided to kill her? Crawford said it was the only way to protect everyone involved. 8 officers, their families, their careers. We couldn't let one person destroy all of that. Rodriguez's voice remained steady, but Michael could see the disgust in her expression. How did you kill her? Crawford finished what the accidental shooting started. Then we staged the scene to look like Sarah had driven her patrol car into the river. We thought the current would carry the car downstream, make it look like an accident or suicide. But the car got stuck in the riverbed. The water level was lower than we expected, and the car got trapped in the mud. We realized it might be discovered, so we decided to leave it there and claim that Sarah had simply disappeared. What did you do with her body? Hayes looked directly at the one-way mirror, where he somehow sensed Michael was watching. We buried her in Millbrook State Forest, about 10 miles north of town. There's a clearing near the old logging road where we laid her to rest. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what Hayes was describing. Michael's sister had been murdered by fellow police officers, then buried in an unmarked grave, while her family spent 15 years wondering what had happened to her. What happened to the tape recording? Rodriguez asked. Crawford destroyed it immediately after the shooting. It was the most damaging evidence against us. Were there any other witnesses to the murder? Hayes shook his head. Just Crawford and myself. Everyone else in the conspiracy knew we were meeting with Sarah, but they weren't present for the actual killing. Rodriguez gathered her notes as the formal confession concluded. Hayes had provided enough detail to support murder charges against himself and conspiracy charges against the surviving members of the corruption ring. As the interrogation ended, Michael felt a complex mixture of emotions. After 15 years, he finally had answers about Sarah's fate. But those answers brought no comfort, only confirmation of the worst possibilities he had imagined. Detective Torres put her hand on his shoulder. We'll find her, Michael. Hayes gave us enough information to locate Sarah's remains. Michael nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The long search for his sister was finally nearing its end, but the pain of losing her felt as fresh as it had 15 years ago. The investigation that had begun with the discovery of a submerged patrol car was now revealing the full scope of a conspiracy that had claimed Sarah Patterson's life and corrupted an entire police department. Justice was finally within reach, but it had come at a terrible price. The excavation in Millbrook State Forest began at dawn on a crisp November morning, exactly 1 month after Robert Hayes' confession. Michael Patterson stood at the edge of the clearing, watching his forensic teams carefully work to uncover what remained of his sister after 15 years. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, supervised the delicate process of recovering Sarah's remains. Each bone, each piece of evidence was carefully documented and preserved, not just for the criminal prosecution, but to provide the Patterson family with the closure they have been seeking since 1979. The preservation is better than we expected, Dr. Walsh told Michael as the excavation progressed. The soil conditions and burial depth have protected much of the skeletal evidence. Detective Torres worked alongside FBI agents to map the burial site and collect any additional evidence that might support the murder charges against Hayes and the conspiracy charges against his co-conspirators. After Hayes' confession, 5 other former Millbrook police officers had been arrested, including Sergeant Williams, who had been feeding information to Hayes throughout their investigation. The recovery process took 3 days, but when it was complete, Dr. Walsh was able to provide definitive confirmation of Sarah's identity through dental records and personal effects found with the remains. "Your sister was wearing her engagement ring when she was buried," Dr. Walsh told Michael gently. "We've also recovered her police badge and her service weapon." The discovery of Sarah's service weapon raised new questions about the circumstances of her death. Ballistics analysis would determine whether it had been fired during the struggle Hayes described, potentially providing additional evidence about the murder. While the forensic teams worked in the forest, Special Prosecutor Rodriguez was building cases against the surviving conspirators. Hayes' confession had provided a roadmap to 15 years of corruption, but proving individual crimes would require extensive investigation of financial records, witness testimony, and physical evidence. The scope of the corruption was even broader than initially suspected. Bank records showed that the 8 officers involved in the drug trafficking conspiracy had collectively received over $2 million in bribes between 1977 and 1985. The money had been used to purchase homes, cars, and luxury items that should have been far beyond their police salaries. More disturbing was the discovery that the corruption had extended beyond simple bribery. Several murder cases from the late 70s and early 80s had been mishandled by the compromised officers, allowing killers to escape justice in exchange for payments or favors from organized crime figures. Detective Marcus Wright, one of the officers arrested in connection with the conspiracy, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed details about the drug trafficking operation that hadn't been included in Hayes' confession. The organization was sophisticated, Wright told investigators. They had roots throughout the Northeast, with protection arrangements in multiple jurisdictions. Millbrook was just one stop on a pipeline that moved hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cocaine. Wright's cooperation led to the identification of civilian conspirators who had been part of the trafficking network. Several local businessmen who had served as money launderers were arrested, along with truck drivers and warehouse workers who had facilitated the drug shipments. The investigation also revealed that Harold Crawford's death in 1984 might not have been accidental. Crawford had been drinking heavily in the years after Sarah's murder, and there were indications that he had been considering confession to authorities. Crawford was becoming unstable, Wright explained. He was talking about coming clean, about making amends for what happened to Officer Patterson. Some people in the organization were worried he might compromise everyone. The single car accident that killed Crawford occurred on a straight stretch of road in perfect weather conditions. His car had struck a tree at high speed, with no evidence of braking or attempts to avoid the collision. Agent Morrison reviewed the original accident investigation and found several irregularities. The car's brake lines showed signs of tampering, though this evidence had been overlooked by the original investigators, who may have been compromised by the same corruption that killed Sarah. We're looking at the possibility that Crawford was murdered to prevent him from confessing, Morrison told Michael during one of their regular briefings. If that's true, Sarah's murder led to at least one additional killing. The revelation that the conspiracy had claimed multiple victims added urgency to the prosecution's efforts. Rodriguez filed additional charges against Hayes and the surviving conspirators, including racketeering charges that could result in life sentences. As the investigation expanded, it attracted attention from federal agencies and other jurisdictions where similar corruption might have occurred. The drug trafficking network that had operated through Millbrook had connections in New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, potentially implicating law enforcement officers in multiple states. Michael found himself serving as an unofficial coordinator for families of other potential victims. Parents and spouses who had lost loved ones in suspicious circumstances during the late 70s and early 80s contacted him, hoping that the Millbrook investigation might shed light on their own unsolved cases. The most heartbreaking of these contacts came from Janet Morrison, whose husband, Detective Raymond. Morrison had died in what was ruled a suicide in 1983. Morrison had been investigating drug trafficking in the region and had reportedly been close to making major arrests when he was found dead in his car with a gunshot wound to the head. Ray was excited about his investigation. Janet told Michael during a tearful phone conversation. He said he was close to exposing something big. Then suddenly he was dead, and all his investigation files disappeared. The pattern was becoming clear. The drug trafficking conspiracy had systematically eliminated threats to its operation, including honest police officers who got too close to the truth. Sarah Patterson had been the first victim, but not the last. Dr. Walsh completed her forensic examination of Sarah's remains and provided a final report that confirmed the details of Hayes' confession. Sarah had been shot twice, once during the struggle Hayes described, and once more at close range while she was on the ground. The second shot was deliberately fatal, Dr. Walsh explained to Michael. It was fired from close range directly into the victim's chest. This was not accidental. The forensic evidence supported murder charges against both Hayes and Crawford, though Crawford's death meant he would never face justice for his crimes. However, the evidence also supported conspiracy charges against the other officers who had knowledge of the murder and participated in the cover-up. As the first anniversary of the patrol car's discovery approached, Michael reflected on the long journey from that day by the Clearwater River to the comprehensive exposure of the conspiracy that had claimed his sister's life. The investigation had revealed not just the circumstances of Sarah's murder, but the extent of corruption that had infected an entire police department and community. Dozens of cases would need to be reviewed. Convictions might need to be overturned, and the victims of the conspiracy's crimes would finally have the opportunity to seek justice. But most importantly for Michael, Sarah Patterson would finally be laid to rest with the honor and recognition she deserved as a police officer who had died trying to uphold the law and protect her community from corruption. The courthouse in Albany was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members of victims. As special prosecutor, Ellen Rodriguez delivered her closing arguments in the case against Robert Hayes and his co-conspirators. Nearly 2 years had passed since the discovery of Sarah Patterson's patrol car, and the investigation had grown into one of the largest police corruption cases in state history. Michael Patterson sat in the front row, finally witnessing the justice his sister had died trying to achieve. Beside him were David Chun, Sarah's former fiancé who had flown in from California for the trial, and Detective Linda Torres, whose relentless investigation had exposed the conspiracy that law enforcement had ignored for 15 years. Hayes, now 70 years old and visibly frail from his time in custody, sat at the defendant's table with his court-appointed attorney. The man who had once commanded respect as a police captain now faced multiple charges including first-degree murder, conspiracy, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Rodriguez began, "this case is about more than the murder of one police officer. It's about a systemic betrayal of public trust that allowed criminals to operate with impunity for years while honest officers were silenced through intimidation, corruption, and ultimately, murder." The prosecution had built an overwhelming case against Hayes and his surviving co-conspirators. Financial records showed hundreds of thousands of dollars in unexplained income. Witness testimony from reformed criminals and cooperating officers detailed the protection scheme that had operated along Highway 9. Most damning of all was Hayes' own recorded confession, played for the jury in his own voice. The defense had little to work with beyond arguing that Hayes' confession had been coerced and that the passage of time made it impossible to verify many of the allegations. But the physical evidence was compelling. Sarah's remains had been found exactly where Hayes said they would be, and forensic analysis confirmed the details of his account of her murder. Detective Marcus Wright, testifying as a prosecution witness in exchange for a reduced sentence, provided the jury with the insider's view of the conspiracy that had corrupted the Millbrook Police Department. "We told ourselves we were just trying to control a situation that was bigger than us," Wright testified. "But the truth is, we got greedy. We took money from drug dealers, and when Officer Patterson threatened to expose us, we chose to protect ourselves instead of doing our jobs." Wright's testimony was particularly powerful because he had worked closely with Sarah Patterson and had genuinely respected her as an officer, even while participating in the corruption she had been investigating. "Sarah was everything a police officer should be," Wright said, his voice breaking slightly. "She was honest, dedicated, and brave. She died because she wouldn't compromise her principles, and we killed her because we had already compromised ours." The trial lasted 6 weeks, with testimony from over 40 witnesses and the presentation of hundreds of pieces of evidence. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against Hayes and 5 of his co-conspirators. Hayes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Sarah's murder, with additional sentences for conspiracy and racketeering charges. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years, effectively ensuring they would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. But the criminal convictions were only part of the justice that emerged from Sarah Patterson's case. The investigation had exposed corruption that extended far beyond the original drug trafficking conspiracy, leading to the review of hundreds of cases and the overturning of dozens of wrongful convictions. The Millbrook Police Department was completely restructured, with new leadership, enhanced oversight, and strict ethical guidelines designed to prevent future corruption. Chief Patricia Wells, who had supported the investigation from the beginning, was permanently appointed to lead the reform department. A civilian oversight board was established to monitor police activities and investigate complaints of misconduct. The board included community leaders, legal experts, and family members of victims, ensuring that the voice of the community would be heard in law enforcement decisions. Michael Patterson used his legal expertise to establish the Sarah Patterson Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and advocating for thorough investigations of unsolved cases. The foundation also provided training for law enforcement agencies on ethics and anti-corruption measures. Sarah believed that police officers have a sacred duty to protect and serve their communities, Michael said during the foundation's inaugural ceremony. She died defending that principle, and her legacy should be a commitment to the highest standards of law enforcement integrity. The foundation's first major initiative was the creation of a cold case review program that would examine unsolved disappearances and murders for signs of corruption or investigative misconduct. Michael hoped that other families would find the answers that had eluded him for 15 years. Detective Torres was promoted to lieutenant and assigned to lead a new anti-corruption unit within the state police. Her work on the Patterson case had earned her recognition as one of the most effective investigators in the region, and her expertise was now being applied to preventing the kind of systemic corruption that claimed Sarah's life. On a quiet Sunday morning in October, exactly 3 years after the discovery of Sarah's patrol car, the Patterson family finally laid her to rest in Millbrook Cemetery. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including law enforcement officers from across the region who wanted to honor a colleague who had died in the line of duty. Sarah was buried with full police honors, including a flag-draped casket, honor guard, and the presentation of her service medals to her family. The ceremony that had been denied to her for 15 years was finally provided, recognizing her sacrifice in the fight against corruption. Michael delivered the eulogy, speaking not just about his sister's death, but about her life and the principles she had died defending. Sarah Patterson was murdered because she refused to compromise her integrity, Michael told the assembled mourners. She could have accepted bribes, looked the other way, or simply transferred to a different assignment. Instead, she chose to fight corruption, even when that fight cost her everything. A memorial was erected at mile marker 23 on Highway 9, near the location where Sarah had been murdered. The bronze plaque reads, "In memory of Officer Sarah Patterson, who died October 15, 1979, defending justice and the integrity of law enforcement. Her sacrifice ensures the truth will always triumph over corruption." David Chun, now remarried with children of his own, established a scholarship fund at the police academy where Sarah had trained. The scholarship provides financial assistance to cadets who demonstrate exceptional commitment to ethical law enforcement. Sarah would have wanted her death to mean something, Chun said during the scholarship announcement. If these scholarships help train officers who share her values, then maybe some good can come from this tragedy. The ripple effects of Sarah Patterson's case continued to be felt years after the trial's conclusion. Similar investigations were launched in other jurisdictions where the drug trafficking network had operated, leading to additional arrests and the exposure of more corruption. The case also became the subject of academic study, with criminal justice programs using it as an example of how systemic corruption can develop and how thorough investigation can expose even well-protected conspiracies. Michael Patterson continued his law practice, but he found his greatest satisfaction in the work of the foundation that bore his sister's name. Each case they took on, each family they helped, was a continuation of Sarah's fight for justice. On quiet evenings, Michael would sometimes drive out to the memorial on Highway 9 and think about the sister he had lost and the justice that had finally been achieved. Sarah Patterson had paid the ultimate price for her commitment to law enforcement integrity, but her sacrifice had exposed a conspiracy that might otherwise have continued claiming victims for years to come. The patrol car that had been discovered in the Clearwater River had held secrets that took 15 years to fully reveal. But those secrets had ultimately led to justice for Sarah Patterson and accountability for the corrupt officers who had betrayed their oaths and their community. In the end, Sarah Patterson had won the fight she had died trying to finish. The corruption she had discovered was exposed. The criminals she had been investigating were brought to justice, and her fellow officers were reminded of the sacred duty they had sworn to uphold. Her legacy lived on in every honest officer who chose integrity over profit, in every investigation that prioritized truth over convenience, and in every family that found answers to questions that had haunted them for years. Officer Sarah Patterson had vanished in 1979, but her commitment to justice had endured, ultimately ensuring that those responsible for her death would be held accountable and that her sacrifice would protect future generations from the corruption that had claimed her life. 5 years after the conclusion of the Hayes trial, Michael Patterson received a letter from a young police officer in Oregon who had read about Sarah's case in a criminal justice textbook. The officer, Jennifer Walsh, wrote about facing pressure from senior officers to overlook minor infractions by influential community members. "Your sister's story gave me the courage to report what I was seeing," Walsh wrote. "I kept thinking about how she refused to compromise her principles, even when it meant risking everything. Because of her example, I chose to do the right thing too." Michael smiled as he read the letter, knowing that Sarah's influence was still protecting communities and supporting honest officers decades after her death. The patrol car discovery that had seemed like an ending was actually a beginning, the start of a legacy that would continue to fight corruption and defend justice for generations to come. The case of the traffic cop who vanished in 1979 had finally been solved, but its impact on law enforcement integrity would be felt forever.